Hello, this is John Epp. I was a senior game designer on Red Faction Guerrilla. I was responsible for designing and implementing the activities in the game. In this video, I'm going to go into detail on several of those activities, giving you a behind-the-scenes view of how they were created and the thought process behind them. Let's get started. When I joined Volition, I was brought onto the Red Faction team, and my main order of business was to handle the activities in the game. The activities, in the simplest terms, are any structured gameplay that is not part of the main scripted mission. There were several activities that the team knew they wanted, such as defensive and offensive scenarios where the player would attack the EDF or have to defend from an EDF attack, and there were some which I designed from scratch, such as collateral damage and Demo Master. I had a pretty small team of people helping on the activities, including, if memory serves, a couple of gameplay programmers, a modeler, and an audio team member for dialogue and effects. Everything else I needed, I had to get by using other assets designed for and created for the main game. I did, though, have some support from an environmental artist to touch up terrain in areas where I did terrain editing and mesh placement. Otherwise, I needed the activities to fit into the world, using level design already in place and basic gameplay systems. There were two main options at the beginning of the process. One was to do the activities through our scripting system. There were several very simple examples already that a programmer had put together using script once I started working on the activities. I decided early on, though, that I did not want to script them, but instead have the gameplay programmer implement them in such a way that they could be created through the editor and settings would be set in variables instead. This helped in the long run, having to manage many activities, almost 100. If something needed changing, it was a simple variable that didn't require a recompile of the scripts. Also, if something broke, it could be fixed in one place in code versus having to crack open 20 different scripts as well. So even up to the last minute, we were able to make updates and changes to some of the activities through feedback and so forth, and have it be very low impact as far as whether it would break something or not. That was huge and really worked out well. Alright, so let's get into some specifics. Today we're going to look at defensive raids and collateral damage. We'll start with the defensive raids. So here we are, we're heading on our way to a defensive raid. Basically, defensive raids were one of the things that we sort of put into the world to get the player involved in combat. It's not freeform combat, as there are preset scenarios as you're seeing here. The player's driving to one of them now. These are started actually through messages you receive in the world. So there is no set start point or start time. They randomly spawn and they get in as far as which one spawns, and then the player can choose to join it or not. Choosing to join it can then help because you can lower EDF control, who is the main enemy in the game, and that allows you to take over the district. So what we're looking at here, though, is one of the very first raids you actually get to be a part of. So there's lots of considerations that went into this. One example here is looking at the level design of this particular area. There's three higher or raised areas around a center lower area. This was meant to be actually sort of a fish in the barrel kind of situation for the player. They've just started the game. They may not be actually fully versed in the weapons or how to play. So this adds a very safe and relatively easy environment for them to be able to play in. As you can see, the player doesn't have a lot of dangerous situations. There's a few. But by and large, this area was designed and laid out specifically for this activity. We wanted the player to have a good experience on the raids, having fun blowing stuff up, defeating the enemies, and so forth, without seriously putting them in danger. We'll look at a clip a little bit next, after this one, where that has completely changed, and where defending yourself becomes much, much, much more difficult. Part of that through how the level and level design is laid out. Now, the assets we're talking about before, all of these assets were created throughout the game, so they were basically placed I ended up placing them, creating the terrain and level design layouts. You'll find a lot of times that activities are not necessarily on the main path, but somewhat around the main path. So it allowed me a lot of freedom in that manner. Let's look at something a little bit more difficult. Alright, so here we're arriving at a more difficult scenario. The player is backed up with nowhere to go behind him, and he sort of dug in where the enemy is coming from a more elevated position. The player is using some advanced techniques, such as using the remote charges and remote detonation to set up a trap, so if the EDF come that way, he'll be able to blow up that vehicle and maybe get some of them that way. As far as the items that I did in this situation, and pretty much all of these, is you needed to set waypoints for where the enemies spawned, where they were going to. You could set up multiple waypoints, though, and the system would allow for a bit of randomness in what would come, as well as in the numbers. The more difficult levels, I believe you would actually get a tank coming into this raid. This raid, though, is about, I would say, a quarter or a third of the way into the game. So you've got rocket launchers and a whole bunch of other gear as you've slowly started upgrading yourself throughout the game. Combat, though, is completely systemic between you, the EDF. Other things that could affect this as well is the morale of the Red faction. If you have gone through the game and killed tons of civilians, you wouldn't have as many Red faction helping to defend you. So that would be something as well that would change the outcome. But so in these particular cases, I basically went through on all the raids, set up all the spawning locations, level design from the terrain and so forth. And created those for a fun and engaging experience. We're going to move on here, and next we'll take a look at collateral damage. Alright, so here we're about to start on collateral damage. There's a couple of things about this that are somewhat unique. We're leveraging basically our main gameplay system, which is the destruction. That was something that we found through playtesting as well as playing it ourselves, that blowing stuff up was always considerably fun. So we went ahead and created a system where you would ride along and basically be a gunner blowing stuff up. Instead of just doing that alone, which obviously you can see we're doing here, we also included the character Jenkins. Jenkins actually was a pivotal character in the actual storyline. And so his story is basically told by himself as you drive around and blow stuff up. And that's, I thought, was a nice way to get it into the game. Other things with this particular setting was that no matter which activity of these you started or did first, you always would get the story in the correct order. So if I did one in, say, this district, which is Dust, or I did one somewhere else, and I hadn't done any before, I would always get that opening one. So it was always nice to get, you always got his linear story, and you saw his progression as a person as you went through the world as far as what was going on. Now, the setup for these was limited because I needed to use the level design which already existed for the rest of the game. So I needed to define paths and things to shoot at that made sense based on what was already there. As the player drives around, you will notice that there are obviously the larger buildings in front, and there are also smaller buildings or buildings off that are very tall. We have an example right here where you see one in the middle. It's a very high value target, but it's a very small target to hit. So gameplay was derived by mixing together easy to hit targets with the hard to hit targets and pointing them out to the player to help them succeed, but also to provide a fun and engaging experience. The player basically, though, did need to keep shooting throughout the entire sequence. A couple of pitfalls we ran through with this whole sequence was actually getting the Jenkins and the driver to actually drive properly through the world. As you can imagine, paths change based on what's going on in the world. Things are blowing up, stuff covering roads, so on and so forth. One of the small tricks we did is we created an infinite weight vehicle. So this vehicle literally is engine-wise heavier than absolutely anything else in the world. And so as you see, as it drives through things, it crushes them out of the way. One of the things we did, instead of them just crushing, we also put this lift guard in front and designed the vehicle so it would lift up vehicles it ran into versus just pushing them in front of you. So basically we used all of the systems we could with the physics and the destruction to create a fun and engaging scenario, but at the same time telling a story that the player could follow throughout the game and treating it as a fun activity. Well, I hope you've enjoyed listening to these, a little bit of show and tell. Thanks for listening.